Right, hello, greetings. It's Dr. Thomas Daffern here for my weekly philosophy class, and I'm going to, for once, record it so that this can also be my weekly, talk. I was recording a weekly talk, as you may remember, and some friends have asked me to restart that. So since I'm doing a weekly philosophy class every Sunday evening at 8 o'clock here in France, I thought I'd combine the two. So this weekly philosophy class is going to become my weekly lecture, which I will upload. And I'm going to be addressing the, complex political, social, economic, spiritual, interfaith problems we're facing as a planet. But I'm going to be addressing them through the lens of comparative global philosophy, which is what my institute stands for. And I'm here sitting in front of the periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions, which I will be referring to during the course of this talk. And if you haven't got a copy of it, we now have a website where you can order it in a printed form for your wall. But it's online as well. Okay, so look, greetings. It's it's the start of the winter term at the University of Oxford, where I taught, and the Green University is up and running now. It's our winter term. The summer is coming to an end at Samhain in the Druid New Year. So it seems an appropriate time to restart these weekly talks, because the winter, the autumn are a time to go within, a time to look at the issues that one is facing personally and so on, but also in the world at large. What I want to address today is the question of identity and conflict. Because it seems to me, and I've been musing about this, all summer. I've been talking to many friends, students, colleagues. I've had visitors here from Indonesia, from Ireland, from Chile, from Germany, from all over the place, and I've been fascinated discussing with them, what identity is and who we are as human beings and what is our purpose on this planet. Why are we here? Is it really to have conflicts just because we have a different language or a different colour skin or, different faith or whatever? I don't think so, but it is a huge problem facing the planet. So I'm going to address that problem in my remarks tonight, because I think it is probably the number one problem facing us. And I have spent 30 years as a philosophy and history teacher, an interfaith specialist and peace studies expert, looking at this particular problem more than anything. So I want to share that tonight. And it's very appropriate for the philosophy class. What do I mean by identity in conflict? Who's looking at this? Well, another way of describing that is epistemological conflict, where people's frames of reference or knowledge systems, which is what epistemology means, come into conflict. And, if you have a different religion to me or a different sort of trajectory for eschatology, if you think the world's going to end in a different way than me, we're likely to come into conflict. This would be epistemological conflict. Another way of talking about it is to talk about ideological struggles. And this was a phrase first coined, ideology, by a French intellectual, Descartes, who was a very great Enlightenment thinker here in France. He survived through the revolution. He was a moderate politically. He managed to not get his head chopped off. And he said that, if we're going to reform society, we have to understand ideology. We have to look at the role of ideas. And obviously, as an intellectual myself, working with ideas for many years, teaching the history of ideas, I agree with Descartes. What he didn't realise is how vicious these ideological conflicts were going to become. I mean, the French Revolution was pretty bloody and vicious, and it involved ideological conflict. Descartes belonged to that first generation of social sciences like Saint-Simon and Comte, who thought that, well, all we had to do was study it rigorously and scientifically, and then it would right itself, because common sense and reason would assert themselves, and people would realise, how stupid these conflicts were. Marx came in on the tail end of that, thinking that if only he could show where class conflict came from and how we could resolve it, which he thought was this thing called communism, which is a phrase he pinched from Moses Hess and other idealist romantic utopian visionaries, really, which Marx and Engels were totally scathing about, but wrongfully, because it was their idea. But Marx did believe that you could, by analysing society, by understanding these conflicts, you could resolve them. So understanding itself has a kind of eschatological or soteriological function, which I agree with. But I think you have to recalibrate, and if you're going to be truly scientific, when a method doesn't work, you have to update it. And, conventional Marxism needs updating, as one of the great Polish sociologists of knowledge who lived in Paris at the end of the 19th century, Keller's Krauss, pointed out, and his work has been studied by the great professor of history in America, Timothy Snyder, who did a PhD on Keller's Krauss. He's the sort of unsung hero, in my opinion, of intelligent Marxism. But, who disagreed totally with the Leninist sort of Trotskyite vision of what Marxism is about. He said, no, this is a social science, and we have to get our facts analysed properly, not just go and sort of shoot people in mass graves like the Bolsheviks started doing. So anyway, but unfortunately, ideology then became a kind of part of this struggle. But it's another word for what I'm talking about today: epistemological conflict, ideological struggle. Nowadays we talk about information wars. That's the same thing under a different guise. And now we have the internet and social media. This is a big thing. Information wars. Everyone's talking about that. Well, as a philosopher, I'm trying to solve these information wars. How? Well, a multi-pronged strategy, which I'll be revealing during the course of this talk, which I've been musing about all summer. I believe it is possible. You see, we can't solve it at the level of information only, because, as Einstein said, you can't solve problems at the level of their presentation. You have to take the issue to a higher level. We have to convert information into wisdom. We have to channel that through our sapiential nature, all of us, and then the problems will be resolved. And I'm going to try and explain how we can do that. Another form this takes is now cyber warfare. It's another word that's been coined. The Brexit referendum was an instrument of cyber warfare by Russia and the GRU and other anti-European forces, deliberately, plotted, planned, and instrumented. And the wonderful book by Chris Wiley, or the tragic book by Chris Wiley called Mind F***CK, explains how it was done as a military operation by a PSYOPs team called Cambridge Analytica, funded and employed by Steve Bannon, who is now going to jail. I mean, the wheels of justice take so long to turn, it's just really sad, but at least he's going to jail. And I hope he'll go for much longer, because he's gone in for one sentence, obstructing Congress, but the real stuff he's done is far worse, and I believe he will be in for many years to come. And if he ever comes to Britain, and we have a decent government, he should be arrested also in Britain for his military-style operation, which was called Brexit. Okay, so that's the kind of cluster of problems I'm talking about. Identity conflict, epistemological conflict, ideological struggle, information war, and cyber wars. I mean, but it's nothing new. We can do it in a more sophisticated way with information technology and so But it's the same old struggle that's been going on since Herodotus first started writing history back in the 5th century BC. Okay, let's make a list of some of these examples then. I don't want to just talk in abstract terms. I mean, I did a degree in history and a PhD because I wanted to study factual historical change and transformation. So what am I talking about here? Well, an example of epistemological conflict would be the very Brexit wars that I've been talking about. And just yesterday there was a heartwarming mass march in London. 50,000 Remainers like me assembled in London and marched, totally peacefully, waving their European flags. We've been at war ever since the Brexit referendum was so-called won by military psyops, mechanistic robots run from Putin and his GRU military campaign, with the connivance and support of Steve Bannon and extreme right-wing forces in the UK, Farage and all the others. We know their names. Tommy Robinson, the extreme British right, sort of what we used to call the National Front. These neo-Nazis were all involved. And it's absolutely shocking they were able to get away with it. So Brexit is an example of an information war, an ideological war. It was won briefly. Britain has left the European Union because they succeeded in brainwashing people through their control of the mass media. But I don't believe they'll win long term. I think Britain will reunite, rejoin. And it might take separate, Scotland separating from the UK, as I think it looks like it's going to do, rejoining, before the powers that be in Westminster finally acknowledge, actually, we made a horrendous miscalculation. And I don't know how many more marches it'll take. 3 million people marching on Westminster every month. I mean, whatever. We have to get really, clever about this, but pursue non-violently, democratically, and peacefully a return to the European Union. And there are various routes and strategies that can take. The European movement is working on that, as are all the groups that came out yesterday in March in London. I support them. But what I'm saying is, standing back from this, Brexit is an example of an identity war. You see, the people that voted against the European Union don't feel European. Their identity is not invested in being European. They say, no, I'm British. Which itself is a sort of manufactured construct. But they identify with that, as if that's antithetical to being European. You see, I'm British, no problem. It's part of my cultural heritage. I've lived in England, Scotland, Wales. I've taught and travelled in all parts of the UK. I feel British. I have a British passport. I'm proud to be British, but I'm also proud to be European. I don't see any. This is where I totally and utterly disagree with the Brexit voting mentality, which said you can't be both British and European. You can't be a patriot to Britain and be in the European Union. I utterly reject that completely, because but it's an identity problem. You see, I'm someone who's travelled in many, many European countries, loved and lived and travelled and worked and visited Europe. I love Europe. It's my other home. It is my home. Now I live here permanently in the middle of France, and I love it. But I'm still British culturally. There's no tension here. The identity war is therefore, I think, in the minds of people that think there's a conflict, and that therefore generated the Brexit nightmare. Now, there are other people who deliberately did it. In Russia, we know Putin and his GRU deliberately stoked this up. Now, Putin hates the European Union. He hates the liberalism it represents. He hates the successful economic democratic model that is pioneered. He seems to hate the very notion of nations living together in peace. It sort of insults him at an identity level. He feels that, he can't abide by and live with this. Now, quite why he thinks this and where this has come in him, I don't know, because I've not, I've not discovered that source, unless it was brainwashed into him at the time when he was a KGB officer for many years and did the trainings, that Europe and the European Union and the West generally were the evil enemy of the then Soviet Union and had to be defeated by all means fair and foul. He reminds me of one of those Japanese soldiers that went on fighting in the Pacific, decades sometimes after the end of World War II. News never reached them, they stayed in their foxholes, living on meagre rations, hunting animals in the jungle. And they were literally being found, flushed out of their foxholes, years afterwards. And they never heard that World War II was over. Putin is someone like that. He never heard the Cold War was over. And he successfully managed to re-emerge, rebrand himself as a politician. But he never left the mentality of being a KGB hate-filled, anti-Western propaganda artist. Old school. He emerged from the streets and the thuggery of St. Petersburg lowlife. Putin was never a proper intellectual, never a thinker, never a rational intellectual. When I went to the then Soviet Union in 1990 and was elected coordinator of philosophers of peace, I was deeply impressed by the intellectual stature of Russian colleagues that I met. Marxists, post-Marxists, people at the Institute of Philosophy, who I had very, profound exchanges with. Putin at that time was a gangster in the streets of St. Petersburg, recruited into the KGB because it was the biggest gangster show in town. And he was utterly opposed to everything that we were trying to do, which is build trust, confidence, and fidelity between, Russia and what was the remains of the USSR experiment as it was transforming into something new, the Russian Federation. We could build a new, peaceful diplomatic relation between the European Union and that former great, power that was now reinventing itself. Well, I certainly believed in that project, and that's why I agreed to take on this job of Philosophers of Peace coordinator. But I didn't for one second think that Putin would be planning, in some dark corner of St. Petersburg, the complete opposite of that trajectory, which is about peace. He's been nurturing this sort of hatred and poisonous attitude towards peace and towards the West, particularly towards Ukraine, that I think can only be explained by an identity conflict. It's something within him, and psychologists are beginning to study this and write about it. But whatever we can say is and let me turn to the Ukraine, because that is a very relevant issue. But no, I'll come to that at the end. I'm going to just say that Brexit, which was partly engineered in the mind of Putin, is this fruit of this identity conflict. I think it's part of the Russian intellectual heritage, which never really accepted liberalism. If you read the great Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev, who came here to France, finally on as an emigre refugee, and wrote some brilliant existentialist Russian texts, including his study of communism as a religion. And he points out in that text that Russian communism never went through a liberal phase. The Russian mind doesn't understand liberalism. It's gone from one autocracy to another, and it believes that only through power and violence and control and totalitarian rule can you actually rule Russia. And this was inbuilt into it since the very foundation of the state, particularly in the time of Ivan the Terrible, who ruled like an absolute terror ruler. State terror was his operational modality, and of course, so that sort of runs forward. And although Marxism tried to, change all that, it failed because it was taken over by this reversal to state terrorism. which came to the fruition already in the days of Lenin, but hugely in the days of Stalin. And it's now resurging back under Putin, who's reverted to type. And in Russian history, which I studied in depth for my degrees, with Professor Jeffrey Hosking and others, there's this seesaw between the liberal traditions of Russian intellectuals, the kind of far-seeing visionaries like Tolstoy and Turgenev and the other writers and so on, and this cracking of the whip by the Tsar and his henchmen. Now it's Putin. Brexit is a result of that. This identity war, this assault on Europe. It was a military assault on Europe via the back door, which was the UK. And if you don't believe me, I feel sorry, because you need to study and listen to some experts here. And the most important is to read the works of Timothy Snyder. Okay, another example of an identity war is the Cold War. Cold War, which I grew up in the shadow of. I was born in the Cold War. My parents were on the left, and it was very much part of our understanding of international politics, this Cold War. I remember the assassination of Kennedy, the Cuba crisis. It was an ever-present threat, and that's why, as a family, we were all anti-nuclear weapons campaigners. My mother was on the committee of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and to her dying day she worked tirelessly for an ending of the Cold War and an ending of this threatened nuclear war. During the 80s I worked with founding Philosophers of Peace, and we teamed up with the group led by Professor John Somerville, Philosophers for the Prevention of Nuclear Omnicide. We sort of merged, and in Moscow, and I became the European coordinator of that, which I still am. And the work is not finished yet. This Cold War was an identity conflict. On the one hand, you had people that believed either genuinely or they trained themselves to believe in communism as an ideal system. And my mother was one of those. My mother was a communist, she's a member of the Communist Party, and presumably she believed it had the answers socially and politically. And we had many, many discussions, myself and my mother, Eileen Daffern, about, the limitations of Marxism. Well, she couldn't see it. She was stuck in that old groove of heroic communism, which has an attraction, and Berdyaev spoke about it as equivalent to a religion. People that fought in the Spanish Civil War on the communist side, and like La Pasionara, the great spokesperson for them. I mean, they were prepared to sacrifice everything for this faith, which believed in equality and the reforming of humanity. I did manage to have some intelligent discussions with my mother, where she and then I went on and studied this at the University of London for my PhD. I studied the Cold War in great detail. My mother finally admitted to me that, communism doesn't pretend to be the absolute answer to everything. It's not a sort of watertight final philosophy of existence. It can't explain being or why we're here or where the universe came from or what its purpose is. It's more a sort of methodology of knowledge, and she explained to me that it's really an educational, project. So in my PhD thesis, I looked at the Cold War in great detail. I visited Moscow, I talked to Russian philosophers, I talked to Americans, I went around America, I travelled and talked about, what is conflict, how can we resolve it, to leading experts all over the world. I think at that time we didn't feel identity conflict was going to become so important. I think there was a kind of failure by some of the founders of peace studies and conflict research to realise that identity conflict is probably the most vicious and the most dangerous of all. I remember talking to Ninian Smart, a great religious studies expert, who defined religion as that which you're prepared to die for. And it's a good religion, it's a good definition. And of course, if you have this thing that you're prepared to die for, then you're prepared to kill for it. And hey presto, you have war, you have conflict. This sort of sense of my duty calls me to go and kill them because they're not the same identity as me. So anyway, that's what I studied, the Cold War. And in 1990, in my thesis, I put forward the notion that the solution to these identity conflicts, including the Cold War, was to realise that actually we share more in common as human beings. We have the same anatomy, physiology, mentality, psychology, spirituality as each other, and therefore actually we need to enlarge identity field, if you want. If we go from the narrow ego definition of identity to a larger field, a Buddha field, if you want, a trans-egoic field, a transpersonal field, to use the technical term in psychology, then maybe these conflicts can be resolved. And I put this forward as a sort of tentative hypothesis in my PhD, which I think time has shown is even more prescient than it was when it was finally published in 2008. Okay, I would argue that World War I was an identity war. For my degree at the University of London, we had to write endless essays about the causes of World War I. Obviously, it wasn't just the shooting of the Archduke in Sarajevo. It was the causes behind that. So the Serbian nationalists who shot him, killed him, felt their identity as Serbs was threatened by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They didn't want to be part of it. They wanted their own nation called Serbia. And they wanted to oppose the Austro-Hungarian encroachments into Bosnia and Herzegovina because they felt, before long they'll be at the gates of Belgrade and stealing our precious Serbia. And they were proud people and very skillful, having survived so long, having got independence from the Ottoman Empire. They didn't want to be swallowed up by Austro-Hungary. So there was that sort of nationalism. And that was part of the causes of World War I, the nationalism that overswept Germany, which came to the defence of Austro-Hungary, which had been attacked by Russia, who felt threatened by Austro-Hungary and Germany. The Tsar reluctantly said, oh, well, better have a war then. Although he knew in his heart of hearts that it was going to be bad news. But it was tied in with this sort of almost feudal concept of nationalism that these European states had at the time. A lot of them were run by monarchies, and there was this sort of, we have to be loyal to the monarch, and if he says go to war, we have to go to war. And that, I think, overswept Britain. The jingoism of the British all marching off to attack Germans as if it was a sacred duty. Again, it was an identity crisis. It became, my definition of being a good Englander is I'm going to go and defeat the Hun. Proper thinkers, true philosophers like Bertrand Russell, who was then at Cambridge as a young scholar, he said, no, this is nonsense. He spoke against the war. He said World War I, well, they didn't call it that then, but it was like a massive European conflict. He said this is ridiculous. He was close friends with many great European and German philosophers. Why would he do this? And he was put in prison for his intellectual labours, But he was wise enough to see through this identity nonsense. And there's some very interesting books come out by a Scots couple of historians who talk about the secret origins of World War I, that it was deliberately engineered propaganda by the Times and influential circles in London, who deliberately planted false arguments against the Germans to whip up an anti-German sentiment. I think this is sadly partly the story. Identity conflict can be stirred up and used by forces for their own ends. Why would anyone do that? Well, you know, arms companies, the military elite that run most countries, military intelligence, you know, weapons manufacturing elite, they benefit from war and they actually see it as good for business, so they engineer these things. That's the argument, and therefore it's quite easy to stoke up identity conflicts. And this was happening all over Europe. In France too, as Germany invaded, the French rallied and said, no, this assaults the very identity of what we are as Frenchmen and women, so we will fight this. Proust talks about that in his marvellous novel. The French gave enormous sacrifices at Verdun and elsewhere. Still, these little villages here in central France, they have a cross with all the names of the dead. I mean, millions of people died. For what? For their identity as Frenchmen as opposed to Germans. Well, you see, this is why I support the European Union, because we've grown out of that. We can now be German and live in France. We can be French and live in Germany or Holland or Italy or whatever. I can be British and live in France, although only just made it in time, because now my compatriots can't do that anymore. And that's why I think we need to rejoin the European Union. It is a good peace project, and I support it 100%. But World War I was part of these identity conflicts I'm talking about, and a tragic one in which millions died. And there was Hitler away as a corporal in the Austrian army. No, he was in the German army, wasn't he? Even though he was an Austrian citizen, he got recruited into the German army. And brooding his hatred for the West, his hatred for France, for Britain, and for what he saw as the forces of liberalism and so on, and for Judaism. He felt the whole thing was a plot by the Jews, because they were cosmopolitan internationalists, and God, there were Jews all over the place. Therefore, they were to blame. An identity conflict broke out in his mind, and it wasn't just him. Other people in Germany, also pointed the finger at these international cosmopolitan Jewish forces. That became part of the next struggle, because World War II, I would argue, is another identity conflict. The Nazis fabricated this idea of German nationhood, cemented it with their education, the Nazi education system. Teachers had to swear an oath to serve the Führer and all that stuff. Jews were forbidden to teach in academia. Liberals were hounded out. The liberal intellectuals like Thomas Mann and Karl Jaspers and so on had to leave. Einstein left. All the kind of genuine peace-loving intellectuals had to get out, or they would be imprisoned, and a lot of them finally were when the Nazis really cracked the whip during the course of the 30s and put them in Dachau and also in Buchenwald, a concentration camp near Weimar, tragically, which they did deliberately because they hated Weimar and Goethe and the liberal period of German intellectual life, which is the one, of course, I love. I've just finished Goethe's travel diary to Italy. I strongly recommend it to people. But the Nazis were determined to destroy all that. Their view of identity was Germany for the Germans, Europe for the Germans, Germany for the Aryans, and just wipe out anyone that didn't fit. So Romanies, Gypsies, Slavs, they didn't like Slavs. They were for the chop, steal their land as living